Fyodor Gaaz, a brilliant German doctor, arrived in Russia in the early 19th century. He came to a country where a unique, often terrifying and merciless form of justice had reigned for centuries. Thousands of people were sent annually on the arduous penal journey, facing hard labor, exile, and immense pain. Gaaz could not remain silent. He witnessed the suffering and resolved to act. Year after year, he fought to alleviate the plight of every prisoner. He challenged the entire established order, centuries-old traditions, and widespread indifference. He became the voice of the outcast, a symbol of mercy. His name, Fyodor Petrovich, became a beacon of hope for those who had lost it. Thanks to his efforts, laws changed, and the hearts of officials softened. The system of punishment in Russia, slowly but surely, began to transform. This was not a scientific breakthrough, nor the invention of a new machine, nor a grand theory. It was the struggle of one man, a fight for human dignity and the very possibility of compassion. For true change often arises not within the walls of laboratories, but from the depths of the soul, when someone dares to see pain and act. This is where our story begins. At the dawn of the 19th century, in an era when science was only timidly breaking through the thick layers of ancient dogma, the world of medicine was a realm of cruel errors. Doctors relied on outdated treatises rather than experience. They did not understand the nature of infections or know about microbes. Pus was even considered a laudable sign of cleansing, a death sentence in disguise. Wounds were cauterized with red-hot iron or doused with boiling oil. Surgeries were performed without anesthesia on conscious patients amidst the screams of the condemned. Pain was inevitable, and death was a frequent visitor. Hospital wards teemed with infections, spreading contagion. Every patient admitted risked not only failing to recover, but also contracting new, deadly diseases. This barbarism was not confined to ordinary patients. It permeated the darkest corners of society, reaching where justice performed its dreadful work. Prisoners, mutilated by torture or exhausted by the long penal journey, ended up in prison infirmaries. Here they found no help, only an exacerbation of their suffering. Any injury, any illness, even the most harmless ailment, could prove fatal. Without proper care and basic knowledge of hygiene, diseases spread like wildfire. Gangrene, typhus, dysentery. These words were a death sentence, and no one could or would stop this endless cycle of pain and death. Yet, amidst this hopeless circle of suffering, in the early 19th century, a man arrived in Russia whose name would soon become synonymous with mercy: Fyodor Gaaz. His true name was Friedrich Joseph Haas. Born in Münster-Maifeld, a small town in Germany, he received a brilliant medical education in Vienna and Göttingen. His views on medicine were remarkably innovative for the time. He believed in hygiene, in patient care, and in the power of compassion. Arriving in Moscow in 1802, he quickly earned a reputation as a talented physician. He treated the nobility and worked in hospitals. It was there, in the overcrowded wards, amidst groans and the stench of pus, that he encountered what would forever change his worldview. He saw not merely diseases, but inhumanity. He witnessed people admitted with minor ailments die from unsanitary conditions, from the indifference of staff, and from the complete absence of even the most basic knowledge of cleanliness. His profound knowledge of anatomy, his understanding of infections, and his European medical practice all screamed in protest against the prevailing barbarism. He could not comprehend how wounds could be cauterized with red-hot iron, how patients could be left without water, or how epidemics that decimated entire wards could be ignored. He saw that official protocols, centuries-old traditions, were not merely outdated, they were deadly. This was not just professional shock, it was a deep personal upheaval. He realized that his calling was not merely to treat bodies, but to fight for souls, for the dignity of every human being, even the most outcast. It was here, amidst the hospital filth and suffering, that his unwavering resolve was born. Fyodor Gaaz did not merely voice his indignation, his resolve was not an empty declaration. He began to act. In the crowded Moscow hospitals, he applied his methods based on a deep understanding of anatomy and hygiene. He saw how common wounds, sustained in accidents or fights, became fatal due to improper treatment. Tradition demanded cauterization or dousing with boiling oil, a torment and a death sentence. But one day, in one of the infirmaries, an unforeseen situation arose. The supply of oil used for treating wounds ran out. There wasn't enough. It was a crisis. The customary procedure became impossible. Other doctors were at a loss. They didn't know what to do. Without the oil, without the familiar, albeit barbaric protocol, they were powerless. Gaaz saw not an impasse, but an opportunity. He made a daring decision. Instead of waiting for new supplies or leaving the wounded without help, he ordered clean water, lots of it, and soap. He took up his instruments. Carefully but decisively, he began to wash the wounds. Not with red-hot iron, not with boiling oil, but with simple, clean water. Then he applied fresh, sterile bandages. This was unheard of. It went against everything they knew and believed. Many watched with disbelief, expecting the worst. But something astonishing happened. Patients treated by Gaaz's method began to recover faster. Their wounds did not fester as much. Fevers subsided. Pain was reduced. Mortality among these patients sharply decreased. This was not a miracle. It was science. It was compassion, supported by knowledge. He proved that cleanliness, simplicity, and humanity in treatment could be more effective than any cruel tradition. One man, faced with the absence of the usual evil, dared to do good, and that good yielded unexpected, striking results. These remarkable outcomes were no accident. They were the product of a deep, systematic approach that Fyodor Gaaz brought to the untamed world of Russian medicine. His method was not an epiphany, it was empiricism in its purest form. He did not take old treatises or age-old customs at their word. He believed what he saw with his own eyes, what experience proved. Every cleansed abscess, every bandaged wound became part of a vast experiment for him. He observed, he recorded, he compared. If clean water and soap helped, he repeated the process. If something went wrong, he analyzed the cause. He learned from every case, from every outcome. His knowledge extended beyond practical application. Gaaz understood that to change the system, knowledge must be disseminated. He actively published his observations and findings, primarily in his native German. These works, filled with precise descriptions of clinical cases and justifications for new approaches, became a bridge between advanced European medicine and the lagging Russian reality. He didn't just treat, he documented his revolution. He created a precedent. A new philosophy demanded new tools. Gaaz didn't wait for someone else to invent them, he created them himself. He understood that effective treatment required not only knowledge, but also the right instruments. He developed simpler, easily sterilizable surgical tools. He proposed new types of dressing materials that were not only cleaner, but also less traumatic for patients. He introduced special, finer probes for examining wounds, designed to avoid unnecessary damage. His inventions were dictated by logic, not tradition. They were created to alleviate suffering, not to multiply it. Gaaz was not afraid to make mistakes. He was not infallible. But his genius lay in his ability to transform every setback into a lesson. He might encounter complications, or a wound might not heal as expected. He did not despair. He did not attribute it to fate. He sought the cause. He changed his approach. He learned how to prevent such outcomes in the future. This constant self-reflection, this willingness to revise his own methods, made him not just a doctor, but a true researcher of human suffering. He didn't just treat bodies, he transformed the very process of healing. He laid the foundation for medicine to be based on evidence, not blind faith. His methods worked. Patients recovered, but this did not bring him universal acclaim. On the contrary, the conservative medical community met these changes with undisguised indignation. Esteemed professors who had followed outdated treatises for decades saw Gaaz not as an innovator, but as a dangerous upstart, a charlatan undermining their authority. Their arguments were loud and clear. Gaaz did not follow established protocols. He disregarded centuries-old traditions. He used peasant methods, simple water, and soap. Where was the complex Latin? Where were the cauterizations with red-hot iron, which had proven their effectiveness for centuries? Where was the scientific justification, if not for the mere recovery of the patient? Their world, built on blind adherence to ancient dogmas, was crumbling. Complaints poured in, to the medical collegium and to court circles. He was accused of ignorance and of undermining the foundations of medical art. They demanded his immediate suspension from practice and a ban on his experiments, which in their view only multiplied risks and disrupted order. They tried to slander his name, to convince everyone that his successes were merely accidental or a hoax. However, Fyodor Gaaz had already won trust, not from those who sat in offices, but from those who witnessed his work every day, the patients he had literally snatched from the jaws of death, and the hospital staff who saw wounds heal and mortality rates plummet. And, crucially, he had gained the support of high-ranking officials and military commanders whose wounds he had treated or whose loved ones he had saved. These people were not medical professionals. They were pragmatists. They saw tangible results. They saw Gaaz saving those whom others had already written off. Their support became a powerful shield for him. They did not allow him to be dismissed. They enabled him to continue his work. Their influence outweighed the fury of the conservatives. They understood this German doctor wasn't just treating, he was saving lives. And that was more important than any outdated dogmas or bureaucratic red tape. Thus began not just a medical revolution, but a true war. A war for the right to save, for the right to think differently. And Fyodor Gaaz was at its epicenter, protected by the faith of those who saw him not as a threat, but as hope. The war could not last forever. The conflict, simmering for years, finally reached its climax. Under pressure from Gaaz's influential patrons, the medical collegium was forced to convene an unprecedented meeting. This was not merely a scientific dispute, it was an open trial of a new approach to healing, of the very idea of compassion in a world accustomed to pain. On one side of the table sat decades of unyielding dogma, authoritative names whose methods had led to thousands of deaths. On the other stood Fyodor Gaaz, one man, and his undeniable living results. The meeting took place in stuffy halls, permeated with the scent of old books and the fear of change. Professors, encased in the armor of centuries-old traditions, spouted Latin terms and quotes from ancient treatises. They accused Gaaz of ignorance, of undermining the foundations of medical art. They tried to convince those present that his patients' recoveries were merely a series of accidental coincidences, and his methods a dangerous and unacceptable deviation from the norm. They demanded his immediate suspension from practice and a ban on all his experiments. But Fyodor Gaaz did not engage in meaningless debates about dogma. He presented facts. He laid out detailed records of every patient he had treated. These were not mere words, but evidence, supported by precise figures. He presented comparative tables, Mortality in his wards was significantly lower than in those where traditional methods were applied. Wounds healed faster. Complications were exponentially fewer. He brought forth testimonies, not abstract recovered patients, but specific individuals whom he had literally snatched from the jaws of death. Those who had been doomed but survived thanks to clean water, gentle dressings, and human care. This was a clash not of abstract theories, but of tangible reality, life and death. And reality, bolstered by compassion, triumphed. The commission members, even the most hardline proponents of the old school, could not ignore the obvious. Under the influence of high-ranking officials who had personally witnessed Gaaz's miracles and under the weight of irrefutable evidence, a decision was made. This was not merely a victory in an argument, it was a triumph of facts, a triumph of common sense over stubbornness. The medical collegium not only fully acquitted Fyodor Gaaz, but also recognized his methods as effective and innovative. He was granted the right not just to continue his practice, but also to implement his approaches in other hospitals and to train young doctors. From an outcast undermining foundations, he transformed into a recognized innovator, an undisputed authority. His name, Fyodor Petrovich, became not merely a symbol of hope for thousands of patients, it became a guarantee of progressive change for the entire medical system of Russia. His knowledge, his compassion, and his unwavering belief in the power of cleanliness and care became a standard for many. This was a turning point, not only for Gaaz's fate, but for all of Russian medicine. For the first time in many years, scientific evidence, not blind dogma, became the highest value, real results, not outdated tradition. From then on, Fyodor Gaaz's voice resonated with unprecedented power. It was the voice not just of a doctor, but of an authority whose words were backed by thousands of saved lives. He received not merely permission, he received a mandate for systemic change, and he used this mandate to the fullest, directing his energy toward the darkest part of society, the prison infirmaries and the endless penal journey. Having received a mandate for systemic change, Fyodor Gaaz directed his efforts into the darkest abyss of Russian society, the prison infirmaries and the endless penal journeys. Conditions there were not merely appalling, they were lethal, but now he had leverage. He began with treatment protocols. The first step was the creation of a specialized medical institution. In 1813, on his initiative, the police hospital opened in Moscow. This was the first place in Russia designated exclusively for sick prisoners and exiles. Before this, they died in common cells or unsanitary prison infirmaries. Gaaz personally supervised its establishment. He insisted on separate wards for infectious patients, regular disinfection of premises, clean linen, and changing of bandages. He radically altered the approach to nutrition. Instead of rotten slop and stale bread, patients began to receive hot broths, porridges, and fresh vegetables. This seemed like an unimaginable luxury, but Gaaz understood that proper nutrition was part of the treatment. He introduced mandatory daily washing for all new arrivals. He ensured the availability of clean water and soap in every infirmary. These were simple measures, but they saved hundreds of lives. The results were immediate. Mortality in Moscow's prison infirmaries, where his rules were implemented, nearly halved in the first few years. The spread of typhus, dysentery, and scurvy, diseases that decimated entire groups of prisoners, sharply decreased. The number of prisoners surviving to their place of exile significantly increased. These were not abstract figures, these were saved lives. His influence extended beyond Moscow. Gaaz achieved changes in the regulations for prisoner transport, the ETAP. He insisted that prisoners undergo a mandatory medical examination before being sent to Siberia. The sick were removed from the convoy. They received aid and were then sent in separate, more humane groups. Women and children were given warm clothing. The sick were freed from their leg irons. Medical kits with medicines were assembled for each group of prisoners. This was an entire system of innovations. He didn't just heal, he restructured the very infrastructure of suffering. For the first time in many years, prisoners began to be treated not as livestock, but as human beings, with their illnesses and their pain. Fyodor Gaaz created a precedent. He proved that even in the most inhumane conditions, mercy, supported by knowledge, could work wonders. He transformed sentences into a chance to survive. Thus, Fyodor Gaaz, a doctor from Germany without resorting to grand declarations or political uprisings, transformed the very essence of Russian justice. His greatest achievement was a paradox. He changed a system that had for decades maimed and killed, not through force, but through compassion, not through scientific discoveries, but through simple yet radical principles: clean water, hot food, and kind words. He proved that true change is born not in grand doctrines, but in one person's unwavering belief in the dignity of everyone, even the most outcast. His story is an eternal reminder sometimes to move mountains. All that is needed is unwavering humanity and a willingness to act.